Bernard. Hey. Hello. I'm going to read a bit from the intro and the conclusion of this book. Thanks for coming out for a book of literary scholarship. It's really nice that we could come out for it. Because it always feels like when you're writing literary scholarship that you're kind of, maybe the people on your tenure committee might read it, but they might not also. And so it's nice to be able to have people to talk about it with. So I'm really grateful to be here. And I started this book, I've worked on it for a really long time. It took me a really long time to kind of figure out what I was trying to kind of talk about, and I wasn't sure what it was. But I think that the question that I've been kind of interested in is like, what impact does various institutions have on US literary production? And I started with the question about the 90s, in which I started in the 1990s. And then now it's not the 1990s anymore, and it's a literary history potentially of the 1990s. But as I tried to answer this question about the 1990s, I just kept going farther back in time. I went back to 68 to 70. And then I went back to kind of like turn of the century modernism to try to figure out what was happening. And the introduction is going to kind of set that up, and then the conclusion will kind of, attempt to conclude. So in 1956, W.E.B. Du Bois was invited to attend the Congress of Black Writers and Artists, a conference organized mainly by the editors of the journal Présence Africaine to support and strengthen the production of literature by Black writers. The conference promised to be significant with many luminaries in attendance. Leopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Richard Wright were all on the planning committee. And as Diop, the editor of Présence Africaine, would note in his eventual opening address, the Congress was designed to be a second Bandung. The Bandung Conference was a large gathering of recently independent or soon-to-be independent African and Asian nations that kind of all met to kind of discuss political self-determination and establish a kind of non-aggression agreement, and also independence from the Soviet Union and the United States, because it was post-wartime. It was held in Indonesia. So Diop is kind of saying that this conference was a kind of the cultural wing of this in some way. And he opens with this comment, which today will be marked with a white stone. If to the non-European mind, the Bandung meeting has been the most important event since the end of the war, I venture to assert that this first World Congress of Negro Men of Culture will be regarded by our peoples as the second event of the decade. Du Bois had been among those who had been invited to attend the Congress, but he was unable to do so because the US government had revoked his passport the previous year. And they had revoked it because he refused to register as a foreign agent, because he was doing kind of anti-nuclear organizing that was international in context, which is interesting to think about because we're kind of having that same moment right now around people refusing to register. So instead of attending, Du Bois sent a telegram to be read at the conference. And this is his telegram. Any Negro American who travels abroad today must either not discuss race conditions in the United States or say the sort of thing which our State Department wishes the world to believe. The government especially objects to me because I am a socialist and because I believe in peace with communist states like the Soviet Union and their right to exist. Du Bois's concerns were not far-fetched, nor were they paranoid. While there is nothing to indicate that Du Bois knew this at the time, the Americans who were invited to attend as presenters included were Horace Mann Bond, Mercer Cook, John Davis, James Ivey, William Fontaine, and Richard Wright, were funded by the American Committee on Race and Class, sometimes called the Council of Race and Caste in World Affairs, which was a CIA front group. In addition, all had agreed to file reports to the Congress for Cultural Freedom, another CIA front group created to covertly launder funds from the CIA into various cultural diplomacy projects when they returned. Cook, a professor at Howard University, would eventually become the director of African programming for the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 1960s. It was Wright, though, not Cook, who had a large influence on the composition of the American delegates. Wright was on the team that assisted Présence Africaine with the organization of the Congress of Black Writers and Artists. He had missed the first few meetings because he was out of town, and when he finally attended, he realized that there was talk of Du Bois being invited. Hazel Rowley, Wright's biographer, quotes a dispatch that the American embassy in Paris sent to the State Department that mentioned that Wright had, on his own initiative, contacted the embassy because he was worried that, quote, the communists might exploit the Congress to their own ends. He requested assistance from the embassy in suggesting, again, this is a quote, possible American Negro delegates who are relatively well known for their cultural achievements and who could combat the leftist tendencies of the Congress. Wright, again, returned to the embassy on several occasions to discuss ways in which they could offset communist influence. This was not Wright's first experience as an informant. In 1954, he named communist names at the American consul in France, and it would not be his only attempt to block Du Bois. Du Bois's name, with Paul Robeson's, was put forward as a desired member of the Executive Council for Présence Africaine the following year. Wright worked with John Davis by threatening to abandon plans for a Society for African Culture in the United States if the national chapters were not allowed to nominate the members of the society. When organizers succumbed, the US chapter nominated Duke Ellington and Thurgood Marshall instead. It is impossible to know what Du Bois would have said if he had attended the Congress, or if he would have attended if he could have. But we do know that the US delegates who attended spent much of their time arguing about anti-colonialism with many of their fellow attendees. John Davis, for instance, complained about the negativity of Césaire's talk and argued with his claims that American blacks, because of racism, occupy an artificial position that can only be understood within the context of colonialism. According to Davis, American Negroes do not look forward to any self-determination. Wright gave a talk at the second Présence Africaine Conference of Black Writers and Artists in support of colonialism as a form of modernization, one that claimed that the Western world helped, this is again a fairly long quote, the Western world helped unconsciously and unintentionally to smash the irrational ties of religion and custom and tradition in Asia and Africa, exclamation point. And this is in all caps. This is my opinion, is the central historical fact, again an exclamation point. And that's the end of that quote, but it continues on, and then he argues that Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, Sukarno, and the Western educated chiefs of these newly created national states must be given carte blanche right to modernize their lands without overlordship of the West, and we must understand the methods they will feel compelled to use. Yes, Sukarno, Nehru, Nasser, and others will use dictatorial methods to hasten the process of social evolution and establish order in their lands. That's the end of that quote. James Baldwin in Princes and Powers, his report on the Congress, and although James Baldwin actually was not part of the American delegate, he's there on his own, mentioned that Du Bois's telegram and Wright's talk, which he called strange, increased and seemed to justify the distrust with which all Americans are regarded abroad, and it made yet deeper for the 5 American Negroes present that gulf which yawns between the American Negro and all other men of color. In this book, I attempt to take Du Bois's telegram seriously, to think about the ramifications of what was obvious to him in 1956, that the government's interest in literature should not be taken lightly, and trace the impact of this interference into the turn of the 21st century. Or another way to put this, I began this book with an old question about how to understand the vexed and uneven relationship between literature and politics. And then that's where I'm going to end the introduction part of this. And then I talk about, again, the CIA interest in modernism, and follow it through their even interest in establishing an African literature in English in this post-war period. I follow the kind of arrival of movement literatures in 1968 and 70 through these decolonization movements that were coming out of Africa. And the FBI's eventual kind of like constant monitoring of these writers, especially, Barack is especially kind of interesting example of that. And what I'm trying to kind of understand is the ramifications of that constant kind of like interference in various ways. And if the CIA interference was covert for the most part, and also somewhat, I don't know quite, maybe more co-optive than harassing, like they would go in and kind of like take over various socialist magazines at moments. They would sometimes establish entirely new magazines. They would sometimes place editors. The FBI story is more one of of monitoring of writers and then kind of calling them up on the phone and being like, hey, you want to talk to us? We're monitoring you. Which I think was done mainly to provide this kind of chilling effect between these kind of social movements and the kind of like the writers that were involved in them. Unlike with the Black Panthers, writers weren't actually murdered by the FBI at the same time. So the writers were kind of like this weird kind of in-between stage. And then this is my conclusion. I have a friend who jokes that most books of political theory have 5 chapters that describe a crisis, and then a 6-page conclusion of Keynesian suggestions for reform that the analysis and the previous 5 chapters have suggested are useless. I have thought of this joke often as I worked on this conclusion. In these less than 6 pages, I will avoid reform. The more I worked on this study, the harder it became for me to imagine any. It was not for lack of trying. At a certain moment, I began a simple-minded attempt to cultivate some possibility. As I am a writer, I am often asked to teach some sort of workshop. Usually these involve some writing assignments, some in-class writing, and some sharing of writing. Trying to use this work to think about the ideas that provoked me to write this book, I developed one that I called Poetry and the Police. Is a resistant and/or revolution-aligned literature possible? Could we create one together? Would we even want to? If we did, what would we do? The reading list, which included Recluse's Art and the People, the May 17, 1960 Situationist Manifesto, and Charles Murray's For Revolutionary Culture. He was a Black Panther that kind of wrote this very stirring manifesto that I talked about in the earlier part in the book. These are very different works. Recluse's is a cause for art that is so beautiful that it abolishes class. And this is a quote from it. The earth is infinitely beautiful, but for us to associate ourselves to its beauty, to glorify it by our respectful art, there is no other means but that of becoming free, of instituting the decisive revolution against money, and of ennobling the class struggle by abolishing the classes themselves. It's very utopian. The Situations is call for the seizure of UNESCO. And it's kind of interesting because this was written during the kind of empire era of UNESCO, before the kind of nations of the non-aligned movement began to kind of revision the organization, which does happen. I mean, UNESCO is a particularly complicated kind of example of like states working together. And this is from their manifesto. We propose an autonomous organization of the producers of the new culture, independent of the political and union organizations which currently exist, as we dispute their capacity to organize anything other than the management of that which already exists. And Murray, who is the same Murray of the San Francisco State University strike that ends up establishing kind of ethnic studies like throughout the nation, argues that, quote, our culture must not be something that the enemy enjoys, appreciates, or says is attractive. It must be repelling to the state slave master. It must smash, shatter, and crack his skull, crack his eyeballs open and make water and gold dust run out. Despite the disparate historical moments that influence them, all imagine an art that is other than national. All presume that art can be autonomous and that it can separate itself from governmental forms of support and be in resistance. After discussing these works, I would attempt to next encourage the workshop to imagine revisiting this in our current moment. How might we free literature from these various forces I have been describing so far? What would it look like to write some version of these works today? After 3 attempts at this workshop, I gave up. We could not do it, including myself. I can't do it. I have thought of this book as a sort of autoethnographic project, an attempt to describe the way literature circulates in the very scenes in which I also circulate. I have been guilty at times of writing as if I have been visiting a foreign land, but this land is familiar. The story of how literary production has been increasingly institutionalized throughout the century is one that I can also tell about myself. I went to college because of student loans. I became a poet because I went to college and took creative writing workshops. I went to graduate school because I went to college, and it was a PhD in literature, so those workshops were somewhat irrelevant to it, but I went to graduate school because it felt like one possible way to be a poet in the world, so maybe not. At graduate school, I co-edited a journal that I founded with Jenna Osman because we had a commitment to literature that we thought of as autonomous, but we started it with funds we got from the university. Almost all that I know about poetry I learned through higher education or nearby it. My second job was in a small college with a large MFA. There was, although I did not recognize it at the time, a bit of a hiring bubble in creative writing as institutions needed faculty to meet the growing student demand for creative writing workshops, a demand that was made possible by, at least partially, by the 1992 Higher Education Amendments that expanded the lending possibilities of student loans. There I taught students how to write a politicized poetry at the same time that I taught them how to enter institutions after graduation. My second and third books of poetry are also published by university presses. And I don't know why I wrote that in the past tense, because I still teach there. And I still teach these workshops. I'm still like, what am I doing? I am also familiar with the State Department. An important mentor of mine, Robert Creeley, was included in Writers on America, which is a kind of State Department propaganda publication that was produced post 9/11 and distributed through various embassies in the Middle East. A college and several other writers that I respect are also in the anthology. I have many friends who have studied at the International Writing Program, which is a State Department-funded program that's at the University of Iowa that brings kind of like writers from other nations in to study writing together. This story is also my story, though, in more specific ways. About halfway through writing this book, I was invited to do a week-long workshop in Tijuana. My workshop, the organizer explained to me, would parallel a larger workshop that was being held for artists from Mexico and South America. The organizers were clear why they were inviting me. I was from the United States, and there was apparently a fund that would only support bringing a United States artist to Mexico. And the organizers added, well, it would not be required. It would be great if I would be willing to donate my honorarium back to the program. There had been an earthquake, they explained, and the money that the Mexican government had committed to the pre-existing workshop had been redirected. So my presence would not only provide some cash for the programming, but they could also charge all the housing for the Mexican and South American artists to the fund. And the housing was very modest, but it was kind of interestingly a dorm that had been used to kind of house women who worked in a massage parlor. And this was the year before the State Department began recommending that U.S. citizens not visit Tijuana. But they had all left because kind of all of Avenida Revolution was closed at the time because of this kind of State Department warning. When I finally got paid, I noticed the check was from the U.S. Department of Energy and had the slightly queasy realization that I had naively agreed to be part of U.S. cultural diplomacy and not realized it. Still, my intention in this book was not just to complain that literature is a genre that is unusually manipulated and dependent. It is to write a history of how it got that way. It is unclear to me how literature might be reclaimed from these institutions short of revolution. Not that I want to give in to what I have described, and yet I give in at every moment. Everything I have done in my life to get me out of this ecosystem has felt minor in impact. Revolution, though. There is some historical precedent that it is revolution that frees cultural production from the institutions that constantly work to contain it. Kristen Ross in Communal Luxury locates the beginnings of the Paris Commune, not in the March 8, 1871 attempt by the formerly French but newly Prussian army to reclaim the armaments that failed, but before that, in the popular reunions at the end of the empire, the various associations and committees they spawned, and the buzzing hives that were the revolutionary clubs of the siege. Robin D.G. Kelly notices something similar about the Watts riots. He notices that a sense of revolt also found expression in local arts movements dedicated to community self-determination. That cultural production was not just a stubborn relationship to the nation, but also to various sorts of resistance is not a new observation. But what I liked about their observations is how sociological they are, how they are focused on where the cultural and the political discussions were happening. To return to Du Bois's telegram, he too was noticing this, noticing the importance of literature to the various anti-colonial revolutions that were happening, noticing the buzzing hives, and also noticing the government's attempts to contain these hives. We are for sure not there yet, but one can always hope, for the buzzing hives are just a part of what Ross notices. She also notices that among the conditions that define the creation of the commune was that the mid-19th century and the years preceding the commune was a moment not unlike our own when artists increasingly feared for their livelihood. She notices that more than 2/3 of the graduates of the École des Beaux-Arts were unsuccessful at finding employment as an artist, which is something that's very similar to our MFA graduates in this moment. It was these conditions that made the status of art and the artist such a focus of the commune, that perpetuated the understanding that art lived, not superfluous or trivial, but vital and indispensable to the community. Art Harney and Fred Moten provide a similar glimmer of hope when they theorize the undercommons, the place that those who are marginal to the institution of higher education. Similar to Ross, they point out that the undercommons, its maroons, are always at war, always in hiding. And then they conclude, the uncanny feeling that we are left with is that it is something else in there in the undercommons. It is the prophetic organization that works for the red and black abolition. Well, it seems absurd at this moment, perhaps at some point in the near future, those current 60,000 holders of creative writing degrees, at least 59,000 of them unsuccessful at making a career in higher education, can make the status of art and the artist vital and indispensable to the community outside of the institutions that have claimed it into irrelevance. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. That was great. It's always interesting to hear something read when you've read it to yourself. So this voice comes forward. Juliana and I have known each other for how long? How long has it been?
A million years.
A million years.
God, I don't know.
I don't know.
When I was definitely, I think we were in our 20s, late 20s, right?
Yeah, that was a long time.
Now we're ancient.
Now we're in our late 80s. So, I thought I would ask 3 or 4 questions from 3 or 4 different points in the book. And since we're so bound chronologically or linearly, I'm going to start with the beginning. And I'm glad you read from the beginning and the end, because then we would have heard the sections where the questions come from. So I wanted to start by asking you about your own, going back to those 20s, where you talk about your own education and the idea that you knew that the correct, whatever correct means, way to be as a writer was not to appropriate, but you also went into a mode of avoidance. I'll read the part. I knew I wrote from a different sort of first world privilege, even as I tried to write against this, both as a scholar and as a poet. But I could not figure out how, as a writer of empire, to not only be against empire in my writing and or to consider my writing influenced by the writing of anti-colonial struggles. There are some white ally talk at the time, but the role of allies was mainly limited to how they might avoid appropriation. Rather than figuring out how to become an accomplice, I became avoidant. And I wanted to start there because one of the most important books for me was your book, Transformation, which tracked your educational and teaching life, if I remember correctly. And I should remember correctly because it's one of my books that I really found sort of revolutionary reading. And in that book, you talk a lot about, having a real consciousness of being a white person from America. And yet, here, it seems like you're saying you had that consciousness, but then you went into a mode of avoidance. So I wanted to know, how did that show itself in your work, in your writing life?
Yeah. I mean, that moment that I'm talking about there is when I was still it was before I moved to Hawaii, which kind of really reconfigured a lot of my brain in kind of good ways, and probably some bad ones too. But I mean, I think what I was trying to get at that moment is that really rigid I don't know whether I want to say like a kind of rigid politics in that you have to stay in your lane, and your lane is defined as kind of being independent of everyone else's lane. So that what you try to do is like, to avoid appropriation, you're trying to not talk about all these moments of kind of influence and things that you've learned and things that you've shaped in some way. And the form that I was taking at that moment, and in graduate school, was that, you know, I was as a white woman, I wrote on white women, and I wouldn't try to. I was kind of like, well, maybe I shouldn't write on other people's that are, you know, aren't that. And what I found kind of useful about Hawaii in some way was kind of like, I kept trying to think about like, that doesn't mean that you can write about anything or that you can say anything in some way, but I was trying to think about what ways would feel okay to me to begin to think about a kind of like shared history of like colonialism, which did not happen independent. You know, like that's my heritage, or whatever way you want to put that. Like, in other words, there's an obligation to kind of think about my role in various forms of, you know, racist, imperial, colonial institutions, and it's not going to help for me to kind of like bunker down and not touch on that issue at all. But that was a big debate, and like I felt like in the time at Hawaii, in which, again, like in the English department, in which almost everyone there, although I think this English department has changed in the years since, had come from the continent, and there was a kind of, you know, debate about like, was it appropriative to people that actually began to think about, you know, how to think about what it meant to be in Hawaii, or was it better to kind of continue on and not talk about that stuff out of a respect? I'm not sure there's an easy answer to it.
Mm-hmm. And would you have labeled yourself a language poet? I mean, that sort of, I've always considered you in that tradition. But do you consider yourself in that tradition?
Certainly, but not. I don't think I would ever call myself a language poet. In part because there's a real generational around that term, but. I mean, I certainly feel like I've learned from the language poets hugely, and it's been really influential in my work. And you know, there's a lot of work that I really love. Yeah, I mean, I could never get rid of that influence or something like that, and I wouldn't even want to.
Right. I mean, you talk about working a lot with Charles Bernstein, and you studied with Bernstein. I'm just curious how you felt race was addressed in terms of writing at that time when you're a student of some of the major language poets.
Oh, God, what a complicated question.
Well, you bring it up and...
Yeah, I know. You know, language poetry was not entirely white, but it was mainly white writers, and I don't think there's any kind of getting around it. And it was also a form of writing that didn't discuss race that much in general. I mean, there's notable exceptions. Erica Hunt is a really important, you know, Black language poet writer. Harriet Mullen is another one. In general, what was kind of interesting about language poetry was that it was trying to kind of think about something else. And it's kind of, I mean...
What was the something else?
I think I was trying to think about how language constructs us in some way. But I feel nervous even talking too much about language poetry. So I feel like someone's going to pop up and yell at me. And then, I mean, there was this, at the same time that kind of like language poetry was happening, there was a large, like, kind of like, you know, development of, you know, the continuing legacies of the Black arts movement. And there was a kind of siloing in which kind of each of these kind of like racial categories were kind of like, often seen as kind of independent of each other or not under each other's influence in ways that I don't think anyone who was alive then would have felt to have been true. You know, like when you go back even and you look at the archive, there's a lot of like complicated reading series, and there's like obviously a lot of like crosstalk. But there was a kind of sense that, you know, like that there was a kind of discussion about race that happened over there, and there was a discussion about language, or, a kind of more experimental poetry in the modernist tradition that was over here. And I'm not, I don't, was that created scholarly? Was that created in my bad brain? It's probably a combination.
So then when you wrote Transformation, it seemed to me that you made a very conscious effort to see yourself as a white woman from a certain socioeconomic class who was moving into these elite institutions and creating a sort of different economic history for yourself as you, do you agree with all of that? And why I appreciated Transformation when it came out was it was one of the first books that looked at whiteness as being functional in the growth of a person in terms of the choices that were made and what. And so it was curious to me that you don't see that as coming out of your training inside of language poetry, which seemed to want to attach one's position as a writer to one's position politically, racially. I mean, I know there's no talk of race, but there is talk of one's position in society as economically, in terms of what is possible for you, et cetera.
I mean, I think one of the more interesting readings of language poetry is to think about it as paralleling these identity poetries that kind of develop around the same time, but an unwillingness to kind of, and to put forward a white subjectivity as whole or something like that. Like, I've been kind of interested in that, and like Bruce Andrews' work in particular feels like it's kind of like trying to kind of like tear down something around, like the heroic, I don't know, Ted Hughes is coming to my brain or something, like it's against that in some way, that kind of mythic white male poetry or poet that comes with it. But I mean, I'm not sure I would have recognized that as much.
As a source for that kind of investigation.
Yeah.
Another moment in the book that I wanted to ask you about was on page 15, where you say this thing that is very interesting to me. You say, this book is an attempt to understand the slide from Audre Lorde to Adorno, to understand why it persistently goes in the Lorde to Adorno direction and not the reverse, despite the best intentions and desires of numerous writers and readers to engage. And then you go on to say that Lorde's claim that poetry easily moves from language to tangible action is not possible in the current moment. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. What do you mean?
I mean, I think I was using, as a shorthand, which is a shorthand, I was using the Lorde position as the one that, poetry can totally transform our political lives, or poetry does a very vibrant political work and in some way. And Adorno's as an argument for like poetry is always co-opted, or there's no independent, there's nothing that's independent. And rather than saying that that one was consistently true all the time, I kind of felt like what was happening was that poetry would somewhat be associated with these kinds of like moments of trying to kind of, of trying to carve out a moment of political autonomy. And then would be kind of like co-opted by these kind of governmental institutions. And that was the kind of slide that I was kind of talking about, is like I kind of saw that happening kind of like over and over again.
What do you make of somebody like Amira Baraka, for example, who was arrested for what he wrote?
Yeah, I mean, Baraka's fascinating because he's someone that's so much involved in all these networks in some way. And, what I love about Baraka is that he's incredibly suspicious of them for a lot of his life. And one of the stories that I try to tell in that book is that, Baraka after Malcolm X is shot, he leaves the kind of East Village and moves up to Harlem and starts the Black Arts Repertory Theater School, or BARTS. It's a kind of revolutionary school, cultural nationalist school. And he starts it with kind of money, this anti-poverty money, that is being put into the neighborhood because there's a fear that there will be riots in Harlem, and there had been riots the prior summer. And so there's a lot of money that kind of goes in, and then once the riots are over, and it's quick, it's like 8 months later, I think it's 6 months, the school does not last very long, although it's really important kind of moment, and has like a really large part of our consciousness or in some way. The money is pulled, and the theater school collapses at that moment. And I think and then from then on, Baraka is kind of like suspicious of of the co-optation in some way, which he'll return to kind of again and again in various interviews and in various poems in some form. Which is also, a big part of the Black arts movement was kind of aesthetic autonomy, or maintaining having your own institutions in some way, having your own presses that were attentive to the community and supported by the community, which I would kind of locate in that early moment around him.
What was interesting, though, is, do you know the story of Gwendolyn Brooks? From the Fisk conference,
yeah,
where she's then pressured to pull her books from major publishing houses, and then they all go out of print.
Yeah.
And no one has access to them. So that's a flip side of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that moment in some way. I love that. She goes to Fisk, and it kind of radicalizes her, and she kind of comes back, and says she'll only publish with Black presses, which she keeps to the end of her life. And yet it's really hard to get her work. I don't really, I was talking with Bernard about that earlier, but I can't, part of me is why has that work not come back and enough, or I don't know. What's the why is there no major biography of Brooks? I don't, why, someone out there write it, please. I'm gonna write it.
So why I'm interested in this question, though, about the relationship between the work and public work, the idea that the writing cannot and is separate from the action. In sort of a circuitous way, I feel like you're saying, because the book is about literary production and its ties to cultural policing in a way, that's not an accident. That the reason that work doesn't lead to action is because it's not supposed to, or it's prevented from doing that, or that sentence is in the book as a way of leading to the notion of a kind of inevitability. Do you see what I'm saying? That it's not just a one-off, that it's really about a kind of, if it were to happen, as in the case of Baraka, then you would end up having people incarcerated in some way. And so the work will never go that far again.
I hope not. I don't see it happening in this moment right now, but I would love to be wrong, would be maybe. I do think that there's a history, and it's had ramifications, and they're sad ones, or they've been upsetting, which at the same time, there's still great work, which I don't want to.
Right, but I'm just trying to see something. Is Baraka outside of the paradigm that you're presenting? Is he an example of somebody who I can put outside of this paradigm?
And none of us are.
Nobody can be because we're American citizens, we live here, etc. But if you have somebody like Baraka producing work and being incarcerated for producing that work and being labeled as inciting revolution, because you say what we want is revolution, right? And so all of those things fit in his category. How is he not outside?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, I mean, I think there's not an outside person, and we all have to figure out how we're going to manipulate and exist within it. It's interesting to think about. I was trying to think about, like, what are the moments that are outside? Because I mean, there are these moments, and you know, like, my favorite example is the Claude McKay's "If We Must Die" poem, right? That kind of has this long political half-life that kind of continues on, and one of my favorite stories is that the prisoners in Attica painted it on the walls when the riots there happened, and so. And I've been told actually by a friend who was in jail that you still can't have that poem around in jails and some prisons. But I mean, and that seems like a kind of like, that's like a hopeful moment and that we kind of want to think about it in some way. But I mean, I don't know. There's a kind of like, I think I would be really hesitant to say that there's like a way out. And I mean, Baraka his politics are so immensely complicated and contradictory,
right,
and mutating throughout his life. Like I would even be hesitant to kind of locate it in anyone. But I mean, I think some of the.
But if you locked it down into like that 1960s period.
I think that work is incredibly important, and that's been one of the closest moments that we've had to kind of people that are trying to kind of write work that's outside of it. And that we haven't had a moment like that since then.
Okay. I mean, I'm thinking more recently than that, he was nominated for Poet of Newark, and then
the New Jersey moment.
The New Jersey moment, and then not. So it seems like he's well, so it's always, so it seems like the attempt to co-opt was then people read the work and was like, no, that doesn't work. So
Baraka was never easy, yeah. I mean, that's what's fascinating about him. I mean, we got to give him a lot of credit for getting kicked out of the poet laureate system.
Well, I'm interested in him, but I'm more interested in this idea that literary production is beyond, and it's not that I disagree with you, but that there is no way, because anybody who understands that we are social beings and socialized by the country we're in, whether or not the CIA is running the magazine or giving us money, we're still subject to everything that's coming through daily. So it's not that I disagree with you, but I'm really sort of interested in understanding how you see writing now relative to the desire to write against empire, or write, especially in a moment like this, where we have so many people speaking up against an executive branch that seems dedicated to the annihilation of so many other people. So how are you viewing the current writing scene?
Yeah, I mean, the Trump thing's interesting because this book it wasn't written with the Trump view. And I mean, I've been really interested in that moment, which I sometimes want to make fun of, or not sometimes, often want to make fun of, when you know, like right after Trump's elected, and like the Paris Review is like, writers, start writing. You know, like we're gonna counter Trump with our literature, which I'm slightly suspicious of, and that it's going to do that. I mean, I kind of want to see literature as kind of like at moments having a parallel to that, like that content comes into it, but that can't be how we counter, you know, racist institutions in some way. It will hopefully be a part of that dialogue, but it can't be, you know, independently part of it on its own. So, I mean, I think that would be part of it. I mean, I feel like, you know, there's a part of me that's grumpy and older, and I feel like it's caught in some way, and yet I also feel like the problem isn't with the literature, it's with the kind of institutions and the ramifications of those institutions. So I'm always trying to be like, there's so much literature that's great and interesting, that I just don't want to see it as kind of having like a political end-all or something like that. The way that sometimes people will say, like, my politics is that I write poetry and response to something.
Mm-hmm. Do you know Lewis Hyde's book, The Gift?
I read it like 1,000 years ago.
Well, you know, in there he talks about the fact that poetry is outside of our economy, in a sense, and that it becomes the one free genre because it's not, because nobody's going to make money off of it, which we are here to attest to. But you know, so that's always been the argument, that literary production in the realm, in the genre of poetry, has a kind of freedom that the other genres don't, because it's not market driven, and because anybody can do it.
Low bar to entry.
There is a low bar of entry. So it seems like that if you take Hyde in and take, I mean, it's true that the CIA, the FBI have these modes of production that are helping along certain writers, let's put it that way. But then it has a mode of freedom, and we're in a position now where people can publish their friends, each other, in a way that has never been the case. So why isn't this time different?
I mean, the thing that I agree with, the thing that is interesting about poetry, I agree that it's not widget making, so it's not capitalism. I mean, Marx also makes that very clear, in which he kind of says, you know, like that, Milton was writing like the silkworm, like the silk of the silkworm, and that's not, it's not a sweater, you can't machine it. You can't, you know, I mean, there's always those moments where computers write poems, but they're not really, and like, we don't write that differently than, you know, someone wrote in the 18th century, where we potentially use a computer, but it hasn't really changed that much. And yet, I feel like that same thing, the way that it's not fully into capitalism, is the same reason why it can be easily conscripted by these kinds of forces. And so what makes it potentially autonomous also risks making it co-opted. And the question becomes not saying that it's one or the other, but trying to figure out when it's one and when it's not, which is hard. And it's what I keep trying to kind of begin to understand is like, when are the moments when it meets that kind of Hyde gift potential, and is not somewhat, you know, manipulated by something or some form like that.
I mean, it's only manipulated to the extent that our consciousness is manipulated.
Yeah.
I mean, in a sense, for most of us, you don't really think that you're producing anything that you could really hand over to the government, and that they would, reward you for, in a sense, you know. So.
Where to sign up? Yeah.
Yeah. So that the problem really is within us, rather than. I mean, I know the institutions exist. I know that the prize mechanisms in terms of who is lauded comes through those channels. But because poetry is so democratized in a sense, I feel like, does that matter? I guess that's my question. Does it matter?
I would say yes, it matters. I mean, I do feel like we're in a moment where production has been dramatically democratized, and yet there's still huge questions around it. Because one of the things, like, I've been working on this project with Stephanie Young and Claire Grossman about what's happened. Like, basically, the amount of literature that's produced each year, like post-2000, has increased dramatically. I can't remember, like, more than, I think it doubles in the year 2000 and just keeps going up and up and up. So for a long time, like, US literary production was like that, and then it goes like that in terms of the numbers of new titles published. And that's interesting, and you're like, well, why is that happening? And it's like technologies, right? The internet, Amazon, self-publishing. But the other thing, the reason that I'm hesitant to see it fully as a democratization is that it also is getting wider. And so there's some kind of, it's also getting kind of like more Ivy League skewed. Like, there's these weird skews that are happening around that. And so that question of like who feels like they have the right to write or the possibility to write, it seems to be getting almost narrower as it's kind of increasing for some reason that I'm not quite sure I understand in some form. And that if we really want writing to be democratized, which I really want it to be, I mean, like, I have a belief in writing still, like, something around this pipeline is going to have to be thought through about, like, how do we bring writing to, like, a different, larger demographics? Why does it feel unattractive to people, to certain other demographics than it does to others? And I mean, it probably has something to do with, like, where the art form is located, or where the production of it is located, which is still very much in higher ed and hasn't changed much.
Okay, we are 2 minutes over our allotted time. I believe that there are mics, and if anyone would like to ask a question of Juliana, now is the time. All right, go. Do you want to pull it forward a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
So you're not standing next to the wall?
Yeah, he's not asking a question.
Be unobtrusive. I can go? Yeah? Okay, so I go to BARD at BPL, and we've been discussing your work a bit. We read your poem, Transitory and Momentary. So good. I've always been intimidated by poetry, and I never thought that, like, it was something that I could understand. But your poem, it's so amazing. There's this one line: just as the stream has no narration, only ambient noise. Like, there's so much contained in that one sentence. How do you construct a sentence like that?
I don't know.
With the help of the government.
I know that's a highly technical question, but I've been puzzling over this sentence for a bit. Like, oh, okay. Just as the stream, well, maybe I should give some context. Before that, it says, just as the police clear out yet another public space and yet another camera follows along behind, just as the stream has no narration, only ambient noise. You just said so much in so little words, but so well. Like, how do you do that? It's magic?
I don't know. Thank you.
But can I just say that the line that goes before it, tied to the line after it, that's pretty crucial in terms of the context, creating context for what comes next, and then the ambient up against. Yeah. So I think it's also the juxtapositioning of something quite natural tied to an oppressive social construction, which is in much of your work. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think in many ways that is your practice. I've seen, I've read many lines like that in Juliana's work. Anyone else?
Some of the conversation tonight was centered around Adorno and Adorno's philosophy. And a lot of previous poetry has been very much working hand in hand with philosophy, but I don't see that so much, and maybe I'm not looking in the right places. But I wonder what you think kind of that relationship can be like of poetry and philosophy doing each other's work.
Yeah, I mean, that's a long relationship, right? That's kind of like, I think you're right. It's interestingly not as prominent as it has, but can be at certain moments. I don't know. I mean, I was gonna go into like the weirdness around philosophy at this moment, trying to figure out what philosophy is. It's larger than a European tradition. I mean, there's like a lot there to kind of like begin to think about what's philosophy and like what's poetry, or why it might not feel relevant to this moment. That I don't really know. But I mean, it's certainly something that poets have done, is they like to read philosophy and quote it. Do you have any insight on that?
Well, I think both disciplines are in a way interested in how one is in the world, like the phenomenology of being in the world. Poets tend to move more toward, depending on the poet obviously, but more towards affect and the way things show themselves, and philosophy is more, it's tries to be more of a science in terms of breaking down questions of being. But I think we're both sort of running on the same tracks.
Thank you.
I was wondering whether part of your autoethnography involves questioning the process that led you from being a young, not necessarily, or like local poet, to being someone that gets picked for cultural diplomacy outside of the United States. Because surely the reason why, because you're being so critical in a really, really interesting way around how aesthetic choices are always political, I also wonder whether, like, then what is your autoethnographic analysis of your own aesthetic choices, and why is the State Department interested in those particular aesthetic choices and not others? And like, what relationship do you then develop to your own aesthetic manifesto if you understand that to be always captured either by capitalism or by foreign policy? Like, well, how does that then, because like what's interesting about Richard Wright and Du Bois is precisely that someone has made certain choices and someone else has not. And so then, yeah, I'm really interested in your own self critique, I guess, and reflection.
Yeah, I mean, in general, I mean, although it changes at moments, like anything around government, a lot of these networks are not really convinced by aesthetic arguments or aesthetic politics as being kind of like meaningful decisions or meaningful politics. And so they'll often just kind of grab anything that they can. I mean, and you know, like one of the things that's been really interesting to me is that the CIA toured Stein's Four Saints in Three Acts, you know, as part of their cultural diplomacy, you know, in Europe, you know, which is very experimental, and you know, and like, so like they'll kind of like, there's always, I mean, a lot of that post-war cultural diplomacy is around this idea of freedom, of like that artists in the United States are free. The Soviet Union makes you write Soviet realist Drek. You know, we have this great, you know, and at the same moment that the CIA is funding it, kind of fascinatingly. In terms of my, you know, like that question that you're asking, there was a tendency, and I think the Obama years kind of interestingly opened up. Like I kind of see the Bush years as having this kind of like very kind of establishment, white male, very kind of like local poetry that might be exemplified by Ted Kooser, who really played a large role in those networks. And then Obama kind of, you know, there's a lot of differences in some way there. That story of the Tijuana reading was, you know, a Tijuana writer friend, right? Which often is how these things work, is through these small stories of like, you know, he was friends with the guy who would organize the programming, and we're friends. And he was like, I know some American writer that can come down and give you the money back if you ask them. And I mean, so it kind of worked like that. But so I guess I would say, like, I'm not sure, like, there's these trends might be the whole thing that I would say around it.
But even that, it was your reputation as being someone who is actively working against or outside the system that got you the invitation.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, that's often the interest, right? I mean, that's how co-optation works. You don't have to co-opt like the people that are already there in some sense.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, and you know, I'm sure that was part of it.
Yeah. Can I ask, in connection to this, what is your thought about Stein? I mean, Stein is somebody who has this great reputation of being, on the one hand, very experimental, but on the other hand, you know, has some of the most racist content you can encounter. And you have the government saying, look, you have black content, let's push that out in Europe to show that America is not racist. I mean, you know, and which is an interesting turnaround. But you and your types, as in the
what?
are big Stein lovers. And and so I'm just curious, what did you do with the race content in Stein up until now?
I mean, the Stein that was really interesting to me was the more experimental Stein, and the race content kind of like pops up there, but it's like anything. You kind of can't quite figure out what she's trying to do with any of it. In that way, in some way. I mean, I don't know. I mean, the reason why the CIA is touring Four Saints and Three Acts is that when it originally premiered in the United States, it had an all-black cast, which I don't think had anything more to do than a kind of like exoticism. But yet the CIA saw it as a chance to counter the Soviet Union's complaints about US racism. It's a weird way to counter them. But they also toured Porgy and Bess. You know, they weren't making
choices. Yeah, it was just content.
Yeah, and they were all over the place too, in some form.
Hi, I look forward to the book, and this may not be a question you're trying to answer, but just judging from the part you read, do you ever worry yourself whether you're setting up a set of problems in a way that they just can't be solved? In that, so for example, in talking about your educational background, well, there were some student loans involved, so there was some state support. Well, I assume you wouldn't be telling a more triumphal story had your parents been rich, right? So almost any story that you could tell about how things happened in a world you did not make is going to have a lot of these problems. And so where do you go with that? This is kind of a master's tools question. If you set things up so that just about everything can be described as the master's tools.
Yeah, I mean, I think I worry that, but I think I still want to try and figure it out, or figure out how it works in order to understand it. But it's, again, like I would never want to see myself as free of these things in some way. And I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think like it's student loans or rich parents, and what do you do with those? And we don't have a free educational system as of yet. Hopefully we will soon. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. It's a good question. And
where did that hopefully we will soon come from?
I'm always hoping that we're going to have a moment that's going to change everything. I don't know. I mean, I feel like if you give up the idea, like, I mean, I think the thing about that question that you're asking, which is I want to understand how embedded I am all the time, and yet I also want to be able to kind of like hope that I can become unembedded at some moment. Like I refuse to kind of give up that hope, but I agree, it's very naive. We're probably not. We seem to be heading in the opposite direction right now. I will acknowledge that.
Hi. So in my university studies, I guess, a lot of what we talk about in my poetry classes is the tension between the lyric and language poetry. And I was really interested by your discussion of language poetry earlier and kind of your rebuttal of the idea of like situating yourself in the traditional language poetry. And I was just wondering what your position or what your view of the politics of language poetry, specifically, I guess, what some language poets say that the I or the lyric can't do political work is, and how you situate your own work within that tradition.
Yeah, I mean, that's a kind of conventional understanding, right? That there was a kind of like lyric and there was a language.
Yeah.
And I mean, if there's any way that I would want to reframe that, is I sometimes think of like those as like the two dominant institutional poetries that have entered into higher ed in some way. And and oddly, a lot of these other poetries, like a lot of the poetries that come out of the legacies of identity movements, like slam and spoken word, have kind of not been part of scholarly work for these various reasons. And so I'm a little hesitant around having that be the frame of the kind of like two kind of like warring sides of poetry in some form. I mean, lyric interests me, and kind of more and more in some way. That critique of lyric feels like something that was kind of said in like the 70s or late 70s, early 80s. It isn't really said that much anymore. It feels at moments kind of naive, misunderstanding of lyric, of trying to, so like part of the obligation around thinking about lyric is both not taking it as the dominant or the right poetry, but also trying to think about like why does it feel persuasive to certain people? Like what kind of work can it do? What kind of, what does it do around emotions? What's poetry's relationship to the emotion of love? Like I think there's a lot of interesting kind of questions that happen in that moment. So I don't know. I think it might just be like some hesitancy around the divide.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And the last question? Oh, is there one more?
Maybe there's not a last one.
Oh, I think there's a question. The last question is coming.
Hiya. So, got to think of my phrasing here. So, in conversation, both of you were talking about poets not necessarily thinking that they're having any thoughts that will get them like money thrown at them. So there's a sort of freedom and a tendency towards poetry being seen more like anti-capitalist than other like genres or media or forms. But I think like in a lot of like, I don't know, contemporary poetry scenes, people are in a way, because they see poetry as something they can like put online and use to like gain like social capital, if not literal, if not like cash. They're kind of engineering their poems in order to make other people kind of like agree with them with incredible immediacy, so that they can kind of like gain social capital and make connections more quickly, kind of move up in the scene, maybe like they'll find that they have like a contact in like Brooklyn, and then they can read there to where everybody can kind of like stand and sort of like agree with them. And I'm wondering if you could maybe speak on how one's freedom of expression is limited when they step outside of those notions of gaining like literal immediate capital and that kind of possibility of social climbing within like a poetry scene, because I find that often very severely limits a lot of poets' ideas of what they're allowed to say and not to say, and how honest they're allowed to be.
I don't know whether I haven't, I'm not sure I have, I mean, I'm not sure I have any complicated thoughts about it. I mean, I don't think it bothers, what you're describing doesn't seem to me like necessarily a bad thing in some way. That fact that people would write a poem because they thought that it had a meaning to other people and other people liked it. Isn't that what you're supposed to do? I don't.
I've never done that myself, but I'm sure people do.
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I hear you that there are other kinds of capital rather than monetary capital, and anything that we do can be exhibited in any way that we want. So that is part of what makes it democratized, that people make individual choices in terms of their work, in terms of what they do with it, whether they are an Emily Dickinson and send it to one person and write them letters, or whether they put it online, or whether they, so I think that's what we're talking about, that the internet is a democratized place, and people use it that way, which is very different, though, than having Norton buy 5 books of yours so that you can work for the next 15 years in your cabin.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I do believe that unless somebody feels compelled to run up, we will thank Juliana.
Thank you.
for-
Thank you. Thank you.